Voters are going to the polls in Florida and New York for primary races with national implications. In Florida, Democrats are deciding who will face off against Republican Governor Ron DeSantis in November. And in New York, two veteran Democratic lawmakers are running against each other in a fiercely contested race for a seat in a newly created district. So Caitlin Huey-Burns is in Washington with more on all of this for us to tell us what's at stake. So Caitlin, let us start with Florida. Ron DeSantis is sort of busy rooting out voter fraud. I think he got like 20 arrests or so with felons who he says voted. But what will be the biggest challenge for the Democrats running against Governor DeSantis in Florida come November?
Hey, good morning, Anne Marie. Well, this race in Florida is all about DeSantis. And it's interesting because he doesn't have any Republican rivals, but the focus is really on the Democrats trying to take him on because they essentially want to blunt his national rise because he's really been building up towards a potential 2024 presidential run. He's amassed about $130 million in his campaign war chest. And he's focused today on school board races with nearly 30 endorsements in those local elections as education becomes a top issue in this year's midterms. And he's really kind of used his lever of government to kind of center himself on Republican issues at the forefront, really on Republican issues, and kind of putting himself in the middle of these culture wars that we've seen on education, crime, and other issues. So the Democrats trying to take him on are former Republican governor turned Democratic Congressman Charlie Crist, you probably remember that name, and the Commissioner of Agriculture, who is Nikki Fried. They are engaged in a Democratic primary, but they are very much focused on trying to be the ones to take DeSantis down.
So New York is super interesting. Representatives Nadler and Maloney have served in Congress for nearly 30 years. They are now opponents to each other. And then there's a third person running in this newly created district as well, who's sort of a newbie. So as quickly as possible, I want you to explain to people like how we got here, first off, right? Because it has to do with redistricting and a judge intervening. So how we have two veteran lawmakers now battling it out to keep their jobs. And then we have this third candidate as well.
Yeah, and if you know New York City, it's East Side versus West Side, Upper East Side versus Upper West Side. I have lived in both of those districts. So Maloney and Nadler are huge names, obviously, in New York City. And now, because of redistricting, they have been redistricted into a new district and are running against each other. And this has become a really, a race that really is emblematic of intra-party fighting. And they've both been trying to use their respective perches on various committees in Congress to try to gain leverage. But there is this question of Suraj Patel, who has run before. He ran against Maloney before. He's a younger face. He's trying to essentially say, look, it's time for new leadership here. Whoever wins will be, Democrats will still represent this area. But it is a good example of how redistricting has thrown everything in flux, especially in New York. Democrats that I've talked to say that they really, Democrats just didn't get the maps that they wanted and thrust all of these Democrats into situations where they're running against each other. And it has at times become quite nasty.
Caitlin Huey-Burns, always great talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And as we've mentioned, CBS News will have live coverage of today's primary elections. We've got teams on the ground in both New York and Florida who will be bringing us updates throughout the day. John Dickerson will also anchor our special coverage from Washington beginning at 9 p.m. Eastern.